Hi, my name is Martin and I'm guitar lead here at Tonebase. As classical guitarists, we play Baroque music all the time and we can learn a lot from Lutenists, for example. And today we are going to look at ornamentation. In this video, 3 Lutenists and 1 guitarist teach you about Baroque ornamentation. These artists are Brandon Acker, Paul Odette, Nigel North, and Eliot Fisk. All of these clips are taken from larger premium courses that you can find on the Tonebase platform. All right, let's dive right in, and I hand it off to Brandon Acker.
We're lucky to have many surviving treatises written by composers of the time. So rather than taking my word on the importance of ornamentation, let's hear what they have to say. Here are several enlightening quotes ranging from across Europe, going from early to late in the Baroque period. In 1623, the Italian lutenist Alessandro Piccinini writes, "In all places where one must hold a note a lot or a little, one does a tremolo," meaning ornament here. Now one does one sort of tremolo, now another, as is convenient, and on every fret and every string, and even eighth notes, if there's enough time. It will always have good effect. The places where one must make a tremolo are infinite. He then goes on to say that if you're ever struggling to play ornaments, you should avoid them. It is necessary for the performer to play gracefully and to not show any exhaustion in playing. In 1640, the German-Italian theorbist Giovanni Girolamo Kapsberger writes, "Playing without trilli or accenti, except in the places where quickness does not permit them, is tasteless. You should play a trillo or accento on every stroke possible, except where there is arpeggiation, because these add grace themselves. However, those of 3, 2, or even 1 note are dead without a trillo." It's quite dramatic at the end there. The Spanish Baroque guitarist Gaspar Sanz in 1674 wrote, "When it comes to trilling, you can always do it, even if you don't find it indicated. On the first and second string, if you have an unoccupied finger, trill them." The French keyboardist François Couperin in 1716 wrote, "Just as there is a large distance between grammar and declamation, there is an infinite distance between the notated music and the manner of playing it well." The German flautist Johann Joachim Quantz in 1752 wrote, in regards to playing public concerts, "A solo actually gives you the greatest freedom to allow your own fancies to be heard, if they're good, since you are concerned with only one opposing part. Here you may introduce as many embellishments as the melody and harmony permit." The German keyboardist C.P.E. Bach, son of J.S. Bach, wrote in 1753 that ornaments serve to connect the notes. They enliven them and, when necessary, give them a special emphasis. They help to elucidate the character of the music. Whether it be sad, cheerful, or otherwise, they always contribute their share to the effect. Without them, even the best melody may appear empty and meaningless.
Now, the question is, what kind of ornamentation should I use here? And I think in general, in these French-inspired dances of Bach, the style of ornamentation was normally what the French called agrément, which means the little ornaments like trills, appoggiaturas from above and from below, mordents, slides, that kind of thing, and not the Italianate florid or ornaments, which become then very active. So I can, at the beginning, for instance, there was nothing the first time. I can play a pourdevoix with a mordent, and what I had the first time through as the appoggiatura I can turn into a trill. Same thing there. The first time I play it, and now, if I wanted to, I could add some extra passing notes to that scale. Nothing terribly florid and virtuosic, because you want to stay in this majestueusement character. Now, when we looked at the simple harmonies the first time through, I will be approaching these from the runs from below, so it gives a wonderful opportunity to add an appoggiatura from below. So going from this exotic chord in the middle of bar 4, I can add a pourdevoix. And I can add that one, which sounds very nice on the lute, because this F major chord playing the G against that. I've just come from a G. The general rule being, if the line is descending, the appoggiatura comes from above. If the line is ascending, the appoggiatura comes from below. That's important because if you were to add an upper appoggiatura with the line coming from below, you would be leaping into an unprepared dissonance, and they tended to frown on that, although I'm going to show you a few examples where Bach violates that rule here to spectacular effect. But here I'm going from my first inversion A major and repeating the upbeat E on the D minor chord and then resolving gently to F. So I'm going to use the upbeat E here as an appoggiatura from below on top of the D minor chord. Now notice here Bach uses an unprepared appoggiatura. The version we have in the cello is without the appoggiatura, but the autograph has So I can add a few appoggiaturas, a few extra trills to create variety on the repeat.
And now, just before we get to the Largo from Bach's Sonata in C major for violin, it's the fifth of the 6 solo pieces, I want to bring in the idea of ornamentation, because when I have worked with students on any instrument, they think performance practice, it's to do with how you ornament and how you improvise. And it is partly that, but it's all these other things. But I found it important in playing the lute that we remember that there are really 3 types of ornaments that they were using. One was small things, which we might call graces. And on the lute planet, we always do those with the left hand. So we pluck the first note, and then the rest is slurred. So musically, what that gives us is always a diminuendo. And that we will find a parallel when we start looking at violin music with all the bowings in, because when you bow on a Baroque violin, it's stronger at the beginning and can never be strongest at the end. So first type of ornamentation, little graces, and very often we have a table of them with an explanation of how to do it. I would say, because I still hear Bach played with main note trills, that there's no evidence of that in the 18th century until after Bach, that a normal trill always began with a note above. It gives a little extra push, a little bit of tension. Now, the second type of ornamentation, which have been around several centuries, could be called divisions, diminutions, passaggi, coloraturen, or simply recomposing. And several of Bach's contemporaries said, of all people, Bach liked to write those out. A typical, very easy to hear example would be the G minor sonata for violin, the Adagio, with lots of fast notes, just linking that chord to that chord. Musicians then were expected to improvise that, but Bach liked to say, I really want this particular ornament. And then the third type of ornamentation, and we're going to get all three in the piece, is when one of those is already written out. Particularly the graces may actually be written out as real notes. And in Bach, there's a way of making a cadence which I've termed in my own head as a French ending, because it comes from the style of French music. And if our phrase ends with a third to the tonic, we'll get a trill on the third, or we'll get a trill and a passing note between, and sometimes that will get sort of evened out to, or for example the Lure from 1006. And that happens in Bach a lot, and we have to look for it to make sure that we don't go and pretend that it's joined to the next phrase.
Let's go on with our Lure. The lute version has these rather nice appoggiaturas, which when I was starting out, we would have interpreted according to the rule laid down by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, who was Bach's probably most successful son. And Philipp Emanuel gives the rule in his famous piano treatise called Versuch über die wahre Art des Klaviers, or something like this. He speaks of when you have an appoggiatura, which is that little grace note kind of thing. He says it takes half the value of a note that is a duple note, or a note that can be divided in two, whereas a dotted note, which would have three parts, the appoggiatura takes 2/3 of it. So in this case, we have a main note that is in the full first measure. We have this G sharp, and before it we see this little grace note, which could be interpreted many ways. And when I was young, everybody was taking the Philipp Emanuel rule, and they would play it half as the appoggiatura, taking half the value of the main note. So like that. But now, more recent scholarship, people think it's sort of lighter like this. And there's a passage in another contemporary of Philipp Emanuel's named Quantz, who wrote the great flute treatise. And he has quotes almost exactly this example. And he says, some people would play it. So some people would play it like that. He said, but that's totally opposite to the French style. He said, in the French style, we would play it. He gives almost exactly this example. So I like to play it that way. It's a little lighter. It's a little less heavy, because Bach writes out so many long appoggiaturas, and we'll get to some of those as we proceed through the piece. The issue of the appoggiaturas is kind of a lifelong thing in the works of Bach. He uses them very often, and we have a very, éclatant kind of example of it in the Goldberg variations, which were written around 1740 or within the last decade of Bach's life. And there he wrote, this incredible, monstrous work of 30 variations. And the theme, however, dates back to the Büchlein für Anna Magdalena Bach, the little book for Anna Magdalena Bach, his second wife, which he compiled in the early years of their marriage. And in that, he has the saraband already, this saraband. And this is what how Glenn Gould played it, and how, in fact, my great mentor, Ralph Kirkpatrick, published it when he was in his 20s. He already published a scholarly edition of the Goldberg variations, which was rather sensational. And in that edition, he advocates using the Philipp Emanuel rule. Well, by the time I studied with Ralph, he was disavowing that reading of it, and he would have probably right. Then it goes on. Okay, so it's a very similar case to what we have here right at the start of this Lourd. That sounds sort of more like speaking French than to me. So, and since they're not written out, it's really free. I can't say that with a great authority that it must be one or the other way. And this is one of the great things about Baroque music, that you have so much freedom. You have the possibility to make your own version as you deem fit.